Welcome to Good Game, your no BS insights for crypto founders.
If you've got a banger meme or tweet, you going to put that in your small group because they paid, or do you want to go and try to go to get the 20,000 likes or whatever? Like that's the game. Like, so it's like stated preference. It's like, oh yeah, I'm like so fed up with Twitter, too many bots, all these things that people complain about. When you have the banger, you want it to go viral. That's what people are there for.
Looking for your next startup idea in crypto? Check out our Request for Startups list and get inspired at alliance.xyz/ideas. All right, welcome to Good Game. Today we have Dan Romero, the founder of Farcaster, that's going to be coming on the air here soon. And what we want to talk about is, the world of decentralized social. We have Friend.tech, we have Lens, we have Farcaster. And then, if you want to talk about Facebook and Meta, they have Threads. Then you have ActivityPub with Mastodon. And you have, about a decade's worth of like decentralized social experiments that's been taking place. So I think what we want to learn more or less about is what is Farcaster doing that's different than all of these other players in the space? What is Warpcast? And is this going to be the only client? Are there going to be other clients? How are they thinking about the third-party ecosystem? And I do want to get into more of the technical details because I think it's important as you're thinking about the types of products and features that you want your end users to see. So I want to touch on some of that. What are you excited about?
So first of all, Farcaster reached a record daily active users basically today. They've been growing pretty consistently in the last few months. We'd love to hear from Dan, how he got to this point and what his plans are next. And the second thing is he announced that he's going to Optimism mainnet. Actually, he just finished the migration to Optimism mainnet. For those who have not paid attention to Optimism, the price action of Optimism has been crazy strong in the last few weeks, and people, for good reasons, obviously. Zora launched their own app chain on the OP stack. Coinbase launched their own L2 as base on the OP stack as well. Obviously, Farcaster is doing something different. They're launching on the Optimism mainnet rather than as a app chain of their own on the OP stack. So I'd love to hear from him why he made that decision. And finally, there's obviously Friend.tech, which has been going really well. Matter of fact, I think Friend.tech might be the first crypto consumer app, crypto social app that made it outside of the crypto natives. Meaning there's actually creators from, for example, OnlyFans that joined Friend.tech and became really active there. So I'd love to hear his thoughts on Friend.tech and other competitors in crypto.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, right? I mean, Farcaster has been around for 3 years, and they're very focused on creating an authentic community, right? And you see this, right? Like when you log on to Warpcast, you see people engaging. I asked a couple of days ago to get an invite for Farcast or for Warpcast for someone that I know, and within minutes I had someone reply back, "Hey, I can help you," right? So it's very different in terms of the engagement that you can get within Warpcast. And then if you look at Friend.tech, Friend.tech is also interesting. I find it also really cool. I've been using it probably daily, and what I find here is that, my behavior changes in the way I interact with my users, right? Here's a few examples. I tend to write much more long form content. I mean, we're talking pages. I don't know why this happens, but it turns out, Kobe, I bought his key as well, key. And he said the same thing. He said, I don't know why, but I find myself writing longer and longer content. And he said that he also noticed that from other users as well. And so it could very much be that, Friend.tech is a completely different social experience that is far different from what Warpcast and Farcaster is building. And it could be true that both can coexist and do really well, despite the fact there's overlap in the social media, decentralized social media.
Yep. Well, I guess we'll find out.
All right. Well, why don't we bring on Dan and talk about some of these details?
Let's do it.
Welcome to Good Game. Today we had Dan Romero, the founder of Farcaster and Warpcast, on to speak about the current state of decentralized social media and talk a bit about where he sees the landscape, as a founder. What are some of the aspects that he went through in terms of bootstrapping his first 100 to 1,000 customers? And then really just dive deep into the technical aspects of Farcaster and how it's different from Lens and, you have threads using ActivityPub, etc. Quick background on Dan. Dan worked at Coinbase for 5 years before starting Farcaster, and has spent almost 3 or 4 years working on Farcaster and Warpcast.
Yeah, 3 years.
3 years, great. And so maybe talking about generally, like, what is decentralized social media? Like, why is it important in the world that we live in today? And and then maybe we could start with that.
The reason I'm excited about decentralized social networks is it brings back freedom and control for 2 specific audiences. So the first is developers. So if you build an application, those users that you work hard to kind of like earn, that relationship is direct. So you don't have some corporate strategy like Twitter or Facebook changing its kind of API strategy and then disintermediating you. And then the second audience, which I think on average is probably not as big of an issue, but in some prominent examples, it's become an issue, is if you've worked hard to build an audience, right? Spend 10 years building up a following. If you do that on Twitter or YouTube, depending on the whims of that platform, whether it's a single individual owning it or, it's a committee of people, they can just disappear your audience overnight. And there is no recourse. You can't sue them in court and say, hey, I want to have the ability to export my YouTube subscribe list. No, that's part of their terms of service. It's like you're at their leisure with that audience. And contrast to something like Substack, which is built on a Web 1 kind of open protocol. If Substack, for whatever reason, was to say, hey, we don't want you to use Substack anymore, it would be ridiculous to think that they would withhold the email list from you. And so I think that there's some convention there, but I think also the architecture of these protocols matter. And so I think what I'm excited about with building Farcaster is getting us to a world where developer has the freedom to innovate and the right to kind of like earn their user base. And then likewise, if you're kind of a person with an audience, you have a more direct relationship with your audience.
So a perfect example of being deplatformed, it's a term. Donald Trump was a while ago was deplatformed, and so was Kanye West and many others.
And myself.
And you were deplatformed.
I got hacked via SIM swap, and I couldn't verify myself, so I basically lost access to my Twitter, which I spent 4 years building. And now I'm more active on Farcaster.
Yeah, this is a good reminder. Even though I'd want everyone to use Farcaster, go to your Twitter settings, remove 2FA from phone number, and move it over to something like Google Authenticator. Like Gary Tan recently got SIM swapped. It will happen to you, especially if you're in crypto. Get off of 2-factor phone number. That's my PSA for today.
The history of decentralized social media actually goes back quite a while. I wasn't aware of this, but it goes back to like 2010. You had Diaspora that it was similar framework as ActivityPub. You had OStatus. You have then ActivityPub, then Secure Scuttlebutt, and then Peepit. I'm sure you know all these names. So maybe walk us through why has this been lingering on? And then maybe we could start with that. And what were some of the pros and cons of what they did, and why maybe the opportunity is now?
Sure. So I think it's worth. There are 2 separate issues there. So first is if you're the average user, none of this actually matters to you. Like what you care about is like being entertained, following your favorite celebrity. Web 2 is going to work completely fine for you, right? Like your favorite creators are already on YouTube. They're on Twitter for the most part, and I think you don't care about this stuff. So let's just get that out of the way. This is not applying to normies today. It's similar to Linux in the sense that if you over a decade do this thing right, it either is invisibly behind the scenes, or you've built the momentum that So the example there being that Linux powers both Android and Unix powers iOS. So yes, desktop Linux never happened against Windows, but every mobile device in the world runs some version of a Nix client, right? So, and then as well as the web servers. So putting that to the side, I think if you're focused on early adopters and people who might have an ideological inclination to try out something decentralized, developers who might find that interesting, so why would you approach the different architectures the way they do? So I think that the simplest delineation is you can either approach it in a federated way, which is what most of the decentralized social protocols have approached it, which essentially, in some ways, think of it as almost like email, right? So you have the concept of a home server. That's where your content lives. That kind of meshes with other servers with some interoperability. And the server that you choose, whether you host it yourself or someone hosts it for you, has kind of admin privileges over your account. Okay. Vernon and I grew up at Coinbase in the sense that we think actually cryptocurrency blockchain architecture is a pretty fascinating way to do it, in the sense that the state, the account, doesn't live on any one server. It lives on the network. And so where we've approached Farcaster is actually modeling it on something much more like Bitcoin or Ethereum, right? And so the idea is that no one server is your home. You actually use the blockchain to kind of have a simple registry to say, this user is associated with this public key, which there's a private key that proves that you are that. And then the whole system after that works off that mapping, and that can live outside of any one server, which gives you a couple of nice properties. So the first is no one has admin control over you, right? So there are plenty of instances of, like, if you're on Mastodon, for example, you could be banned for being a capitalist or whatever, the term.
Which has happened before.
Yeah. And whatever, that's their right? That's you pick your server. But more importantly, and I actually think if we think about this from the developer perspective, federation is actually a very difficult system to interact with as that system scales, because inevitably you're now going to have thousands of servers that you need to kind of maintain state for. So in order to build an application that kind of takes in the kind of like full global state of a network, you have to actually build a mini version of Google, right? And it might be a little bit easier in that because the relative to Google and how many web pages there are fewer number of servers. But for example, Blue Sky, which has a very similar architecture, AT Proto, to Mastodon, some slight differences, has already indicated that as the network scales, developers are going to need something called peering agreements to get access to the data. So that's not permissionless. But peering agreement is a like special agreement, like you get access to this set of APIs, and obviously to get the fire hose, that would require you to kind of like negotiate a deal with them, sign some terms of service. And so as the network grows, it gets less and less permissionless over time. Contrast that to something like Farcaster, which again is modeled after something like Ethereum or Bitcoin. Farcaster, all of the data that's not on chain, and we can talk about that later, lives in something called the Farcaster Hub. The Farcaster Hub has the entire global state of the Farcaster network within reason at any given moment, similar to an Ethereum node or a Bitcoin node having the full global state of that blockchain at any given moment. And our point of view is that is the thing to actually go build. And that's actually somewhat uniquely enabled by cryptocurrency blockchains, in the sense that if you can remove the accounts from the server, then the server can just focus on the content, and then the kind of like identity can actually live on something outside of a server, and you can actually get to some version of global state. That's actually the core architectural difference between Farcaster and the kind of like federated versions of things.
So just to double click on that, in a federated system, who decides if a user is going to get banned by the rest of the network?
A couple different things. So the first is, in I think ActivityPub world, and I'm not an expert here, but this is my general understanding. You actually can just boot up a new server, but the other servers can choose to defederate with you. So now the kind of access to the network is based on the kind of, if you think of that, there may be some, call it 10 core ActivityPub instances, which now if Threads actually falls through on becoming an ActivityPub instance, they basically are 90% of the network, even with the decrease in DAOs, right? But in those worlds, each of those instances can decide to peer with you or not. So let's say you boot up your own ActivityPub instance, no one has to peer with you. So you're not guaranteed to kind of get any content put into that network. In AT Proto, they have a work in progress spec that's using something called DIDs and verified credentials. And they actually have something called placeholder, which if you squint at it, they're basically trying to come up with a consortium that looks like DNS, which there's a lot of work there to try to make a version of a blockchain registry without using the word blockchain, because I think within the AT Proto world, at least my understanding is like crypto is bad and you wouldn't want to ever use crypto for anything because it's all grifts and scams, which I think some people have just like this kind of delusion in their brain that just because there's a word cryptocurrency, like, you have that. Whereas I think what we've approached is Ethereum as a global computer that actually can serve the purpose of creating a decentralized kind of verifiable identity registry that, if you think about it, it's like a database where each user is the admin for their single row in the database, and you can actually design it so that there's no actual like super admin that has access to the whole database. So you can put a non-upgradable contract. Your identity on Farcaster is controlled. The right access to that one row is your Ethereum private key.
So let's play devil's advocate and say that Threads holds one of the instances in this federated world. And let's say Mark is like, you know what? I don't like the server. I don't want our followers or our users interacting with the server. They can defederate, right?
Yes.
So they have the most control in that platform. Like they could do whatever they want because they have all the users, right?
Yes, and I fully expect whatever version of Meta's ActivityPub integration will be, I promise you that they're not going to allow you to permissionlessly suck all of the Threads graph out. So they're going to have some version of, they might federate the content out, or you can federate your content in. But that, just like everything with Facebook, I think it's going to be a controlled black box, right? It's like the big myth everyone always said, Facebook's selling my data. No. Facebook never lets your data leave Facebook. What you can do is you can pay Facebook to target people on Facebook, but the data actually stays inside Facebook. That's what makes Facebook valuable.
So this is pseudo decentralized.
Yeah, and to be fair, I'm kind of like hypothesizing on what I think they're going to do, but knowing a history of Facebook, I do not think that they're going to allow a leaky data abstraction of their entire Threads graph. If so, then you're going to have a whole bunch of other people using that to help bootstrap their own graphs.
Or connecting with servers that their mission doesn't align with, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is where you start. You start with the extreme. Like, of course I don't want to, connect to a neo-Nazi ActivityPub instance. No one could disagree with that. Totally reasonable. But then it like works its way, and then it's like, wait a second. Like we started with like the thing that 99.9% of people agree with, to now it's 80%, to now it's, Threads is deciding what is good versus bad. And I think we've run into these issues before, right? And so, COVID, I think, is a great example of this, where, we watched the COVID discourse change like 3 or 4 times. It was like hard to keep track. It's like depending on who's in office, like who's saying what. But the reality is there was a period of time while we were going through a global pandemic that like the 3 or 4 major internet platforms in the United States decided this is is the allowed discourse on COVID, period. And it's like, a couple of years later, we've turned out it's like the government has even changed its opinion on that. And so it's like, this is kind of weird that we're so centralized in terms of like what we can talk about, especially for a topic that's extremely relevant for having public discourse, right? And so I'm less on the like, this is what speech should be allowed, as much as building protocols that allow for competing clients, moderation, algorithms. It's actually much more akin to our like the core First Amendment rights we have in the country, right? Like imagine if there were only 10 newspapers and those 10 newspapers got to decide, or 3 television stations, which we used to have, right? Versus like, of course, like we have a whole kind of spectrum of news sources, right? So you can get a left-wing news source, you can get a right-wing news source, you can try to find a centrist, but the idea is that they can all compete. Whereas when you have these large centralized platforms, it's much more akin to having 3 television stations. And that's the acceptable amount of speech. And so I think what's important is getting to a place where if you feel like there's an underserved need in the market, you as a developer, an entrepreneur, content creator, have the ability to go try that and kind of like earn your audience in the marketplace.
So just a really quick question on that, just in case we derail from this conversation. But what is the largest client on top of Farcaster that remotely rivals Warpcast, which is your own client? Is there any such client that can rival Warpcast today?
There are definitely a few other clients. The reality is 99% of users are using Warpcast. I mean, today we're still in a gated, although we just migrated to OP mainnet yesterday, which is exciting. But the kind of like permissionless sign-up era of Farcaster, where you can just go and interact with the contract, that hasn't started yet. So that's a couple of weeks away. So I would imagine after that happens, you're going to start to see growth, albeit slow to start, but growth with other clients because they're going to have an experience where you don't have to use Warpcast. Every user today has signed up on the kind of protocol during the beta period through Warpcast. But I think what's important is, one, there are a couple of commercial alternatives. So there's a company called Jam. They have a fully featured Farcaster client. There are some open source alternatives, right? There's one project called Opencast being built. And I would imagine as the network grows, the incentive to actually create an alternative to Warpcast will grow as well.
So maybe this could be a good segue into like talking about the technical implementation of Farcaster. In fact, I spent some time and watched all of Arun's like 5-minute videos that he has. To me, that's like awesome, right? Because like whenever I study, developer docs, reading through it is great, but you miss a lot of nuance. So I appreciated those 5-minute videos. And so, there were four things he talked about that he wants to like solve with Farcast, right? Identity, authentication, availability, consistency. And so I really want to talk about identity because I feel like, obviously V3 has changed and you guys are migrating to like CCID, but maybe talk about what is the plan with identity and authentication. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because, we had some instances of like, if you look at what's happening today, like everything has been centralized to like Google authentication, right? Like with OAuth login. So like it's either going to be Google, Facebook Connect, or like Amazon or et cetera. So I feel like a lot of the power for identity and authentication is being shifted to like 3 or 4 major players in the ecosystem. And so I'm curious on like the technical implementation of identity, right? I know you use FID or Farcaster ID, which essentially assigns a numerical number to the user, and then it maps a username to it. And so maybe talk a bit about the identity piece on how that works with the new implementation of CCID and sub-ENS domains. And then where do you see this all going from a ecosystem perspective? Do you want people to use Farcaster ID as a login method? Like where do you see it going in the future?
Yeah, so I think it's worth kind of working it up from first principles.
Yeah.
And this is kind of informed by 3 years of a beta where I spent a lot of time talking to users and Varun and I and the team think through kind of like from a developer experience standpoint. So let's use centralized social media as kind of the reference point for what does a consumer expect when they're actually having some version of identity on a social platform. So the first thing is users actually want the ability to upgrade their username. Like that's a kind of rite of passage for a lot of folks. Maybe you start and you have like a couple numbers at the end of your username, and then over time, maybe you get bigger. You decide, like from a business standpoint, you want to acquire a different handle and simplify things, or make it look cooler. Seems small, but that's actually important. And in a world where you decide to map everything to a username, and if the system is decentralized, you cannot force all of the other people to move their follows. So now you run into this little bit of a conundrum where I have, 100,000 people following me, but they're all following a specific name. I want to switch the name. How do you actually go do that in a system where every user is effectively in control of their actions, right? Twitter could do that, but like you can't necessarily. So what you actually do is you have to kind of take what actually happens behind the scenes on most social media is you're actually not represented by your username on Twitter or Instagram. You're represented by a database ID, a UI ID, like a user ID. Which allows you to easily swap a username, right? It's just as a cosmetic modifier. So that's one thing that we've done with Farcaster. It's also enabled us to have the ability to give every user who signs up a free username. We call it an F name, and we're using CCIP read, which is a kind of extension to ENS, similar to like Coinbase has CBID. But the point is that we can actually say, when you sign up for Farcaster, if you don't have ENS, no problem. Like you can get started. And I think that that's actually really important because if the first thing for signing up for a social product is please make sure you have an ENS, the amount of growth and drop off you're going to have is crazy. Now, we think ENS is great. And so what we've actually been able to do because of this kind of like having the ID number represent you is we allow you to be able to associate an ENS with your name. So that's like one component. And so I actually think that's important is I think a lot of people tend to think of identity as the username, when the reality is, from our standpoint, identity is actually the summation of everything that you're doing within an app. And that in of itself is actually much more valuable from a developer standpoint than any one specific identifier. And so the second thing Farcaster does is it allows you to associate with that kind of FID multiple Ethereum addresses, and in the future, arguably you could do other blockchains as well. And so you might be familiar with something like EAS or Gitcoin Passport or virtual verified credentials (DIDs). Farcaster effectively has a version of that that just essentially allows you to prove you kind of like do an EIP 712 for the technically inclined, but it's essentially like you prove you own this Ethereum address, you prove you own Farcaster, and you kind of like create like a little proof that gets stored on a Farcaster hub. But that's great because let's say I have, a cold storage address, I have like a hot wallet or whatever, I can selectively choose. And Imran, I actually think we got into it a little bit on Twitter, talking about like the idea of like people wanting control over their on-chain identity. And I'm 100% in agreement that I actually think 5 years from now, people are going to be a lot more careful about what they publicly associate with their kind of identity, like themselves, right, across multiple addresses on chain, right, because it's a permanent record. And so I think we're going to see a bunch of new things come up around zero knowledge, right? So you can selectively reveal. And so our bet with Farcaster is today, I think a lot of, crypto, especially Ethereum apps, assume everyone's going to sign in with Ethereum and you have an ENS, and that's the world we're going to live in. And I'm convinced that is not the world we're going to live in. It's actually going to live in, you're going to contain multitudes in the sense that you will have many addresses and you will kind of have to have the software that can handle all that. And our view is in a world where you already have multiple addresses, the Farcaster ID with those kind of associated verifications starts to become a meta concept, right? Like, because it's spread across a lot of addresses, people are going to go and first check, if you give me an address, they're going to take that address, check Farcaster to say, what's the Farcaster ID associated with it? And then go find all the other addresses to start to reconstruct an identity. In addition to what content are they posting? What content are they liking? Who are they following? And so that's the kind of vision for Farcaster. I also think identity gets this thing where people have this assumption that like there's a winning identity layer. Identity layers are not horizontal. Identity layers are emergent, right? So if you think about like what are the primary ways we do identity on the internet today in the kind of Web 2 context? Well, actually, it starts with Web 1. It's email. Email was not created as an identity system. It was created as a messaging system that has utility. But by virtue of getting mass adoption, the emergent characteristic is that you use email as the primary identifier for a lot of services when you sign up. When we shifted to mobile, the thing that exists even more than email, if you think about a lot of people in developing countries don't even have an email, or it's not the first thing they have. Everyone has a phone number. So phone number actually started to outcompete, right? Like you can't sign up with an email for WhatsApp. You sign up with a phone number, right? And so phone number and email are both emergent identity systems. And then in addition, the kind of popular ones today are sign in with Google, sign in with Apple, and that's a result of these services having billions of people have a kind of core account associated with their mobile, right? And so my view is identity, and all those coexist, right? You have services that use phone number, that you have services that use email, and so kind of like coming up with this model that this is going to be the identity layer for crypto. You're going to have this kind of multifaceted world. And actually, one of the things that we're excited about having Farcaster, the kind of like, we have a minimal on-chain representation, right? The FID contract is like pretty simple, but it is on OP mainnet, and there are other kind of identity focused projects there. WorldCoin is there. EAS is like a big initiative within Ethereum attestation service on OP mainnet. And so our view is developers are actually going to decide what constitutes identity, because they're going to pull things off the shelf and kind of reconstruct it for whatever app that they're building.
You mentioned a really good important point, which is that we've seen over the years so many different decentralized identity projects. And I remember having this discussion with Imran a couple of years ago, and I said to Imran, there's no way these things will work, because the identity that will actually get adopted, it will come from an application that gets mass adoption. And therefore, you just pay attention to whichever app that actually gets adopted. It could be social, like it could be a game, it could be a financial application or whatever. And the decentralized identity will get adopted as a result of that. So really, I can't agree more on that point.
Yeah, the other point there is, if you were to ask me who's the best position to go do identity, it's Coinbase. They have 100 million
Yes.
KYC accounts, right? So if Coinbase
100%.
wants to do identity, if someone is kind of thinking about it like that, that's their opportunity to like create the best attempt at a layer because they already have the app with 100 million people and KYC. That's extremely expensive to go do. And so the fact that they've been able to do that because people are willing to do that to trade and pay them, great side effect, right? I mean, that's basically, if you think about like sign in with Apple, in order to use an iTunes account, you have to have a valid payment method. Like that in of itself is a pretty powerful, and I think Apple has like 1 billion users across all their iOS devices. And so I think people underrate the value of identity comes from a fact that you have a large active user base, not because you came up with the best technical specification. And I think that's like one of the things I always kind of get a little annoyed with people in crypto is they're like, oh, look, I came up with the perfect solution. And it's like, no, you need to come up with the app with users.
The Apple one is also another really good point, because recently when I tried a bunch of apps, so they all ask the user different ways to get onboarded. Some of them use Google, some of them use Facebook, some of them use just the seed phrase, and others use Apple ID. And I find myself using Apple ID all the time because it's natively built into your iPhone, and it's the easiest way to get onboarded. And as a result, I think Apple ID becomes the standard, the identity for crypto mobile apps at this moment.
You can hide your email.
You can hide your email. That's right.
I'm a little bit of like an Apple like nerd in terms of all the things that they change. And so one of the interesting things that they did is, and we don't actually have sign in with Apple on Warpcast. And the way you can get around that is if you don't offer any third-party auth services. So if you strictly just say, give me your email, at least today, Apple doesn't require that. The moment you want to have a single thing that's like sign in with X, you have to offer Apple. Like Apple forces you, as soon as you use a third-party auth service, you also have to include Apple. There are some people think that potentially is like, antitrust issues, but that's the reality of where we are. And to your point though, so as much as a developer might not like that, the user likes it because Apple is actually extremely focused on allowing you to have more control. It's like forcing someone to allow hide email. That's kind of nice. Like I don't have to worry about you leaking, my email or selling it to marketers or things like that. And so this is a classic thing where, as a developer, I can't stand a lot of the stuff that Apple does. I'm like, 30%, like NFT stuff, like all this. But as a user, most of the rest of the time, I'm like, this is actually pretty great. Like, I don't have to like have all these people trying to scam me or upsell me or all this kind of data oriented. I have actually a lot more control. So it's a little bit of a paradox. It's kind of like I claim I don't like it, but then as a consumer I do, and so you kind of have to deal with that reality.
You mentioned your move to OP in our conversation. What was the reason for OP? Why did you pick the OP stack? Was it because of WorldCoin and all the identity? I'm curious, just because, they have users with identity there. Is it because of, other consumer products that are being built around that ecosystem? I'm curious on why you chose that stack.
Yeah, so I think it's broad. We wanted to make a bet on Ethereum. Our view is Ethereum is the best ecosystem for us to go build Farcaster because it has the highest overlap of people building new things, and I think just generally interested in like a decentralized social protocol, right? There's this kind of weird, how do you grow a decentralized social protocol? It's like find all the people who are potentially interested in it and then try to convince those people to be daily active users. And if you get to a sufficient scale, then you can actually start to maybe get a flywheel of just like, oh, there are enough people on here that it's interesting. So it's a little bit of like, we had to kind of like pick a community. So Ethereum is the bet. And so in a world where we've picked Ethereum, like it doesn't make sense to use a non EVM chain. So you kind of constrain yourself to that. Originally, we were planning to do ETH L1 because our view was like, hey, we actually want the composability to be high. And when we were working on this, the last couple of years, there was really nothing happening on L2s. I think that's changed in the last 6 months. And I will give credit to Coinbase selecting the OP stack for base. I think catalyzed, then you got Zora and you have Mirror and you have a lot of these applications that were all kind of ETH L1 oriented. It hadn't already moved to something like a Polygon or Solana or something like that. Once Coinbase kind of tipped in the favor of the kind of OP stack, our view is the momentum for a lot of these more consumer oriented, Ethereum oriented protocol type apps have moved. I mean, you saw Friend.tech on Base Base Paint. Like these are the types of projects that I think generally like were all ETH L1 oriented before, because those projects and kind of builders realized that the highest critical concentration of kind of a combination of people who had influence on crypto Twitter, people who have some amount of money, right? They're willing to go spend half an ETH on something, or, so there's actually some TVL on, not some, a lot of value on ETH L1. And I think what's happened with Base, and this was our bet, and so it seems to be playing out, is you're actually getting a lot of the stuff that used to kind of happen on ETH L1, right? Like loot in 2021, experiment on ETH L1. The equivalent of loot today is probably happening on Base or Zora or OP mainnet. And so I think that's where our audience and our initial bet is. And so it's not to say that the technology of the other chains attempts on L2s is like, worse. In some cases might even be better or more baked, right? Like there's all these fights on Twitter about like OP doesn't have fraud proofs yet. And like, yeah, they don't. But I think one thing people underrate with crypto is vibes matter. And it's like, maybe that's a little bit pejorative, but Ethereum, for a lot of its success, is a result of cultivating a developer ecosystem, a kind of like long-term vision. And I think Vitalik is world-class at this, like probably the best in crypto. And, everyone always looks at Ethereum through the lens of like, oh, transactions per second, or it doesn't have this set of features. When the reality is like the early momentum that has sustained has been a result of people are excited about Ethereum and developers are excited about Ethereum. And so I think that's where we have tried to make a decision, and our bet is that the OP stack generally is going to have a lot of that kind of momentum coming out of Ethereum into that ecosystem. I could be wrong. And in 12 months, we could be saying, hey, it didn't end up panning out. The technology didn't get there. We don't believe that, like, obviously because we made the bet, but like, I don't claim to have the future. It's just like, this is a risk-adjusted bet for us. And the other thing I think we really like about the OP team is their deep commitment to open source. Like everything is MIT licensed. It's public good oriented. Like that, I think plays nicely with Farcaster.
So just a follow-up question. An obvious alternative to the OP mainnet is launching your own chain on the OP stack, which many projects have done recently, including Zora, Coinbase, obviously. And you're at a point where you have enough users to warrant thinking about launching your own chain. So why did you choose the OP mainnet instead of launching your own chain?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, we considered it. I'm actually a small investor in a company, Conduit, which I think is like helping boot some of this up within the OP ecosystem. I think our point of view is we don't want to be first in the first crop of people running their own chains. Like I think it would be 12 to 18 months from now. We basically deal with a little bit more cost on OP mainnet in terms of having to use it and foregoing, sequencer fees or whatever potential revenue from that from a protocol standpoint. But the ecosystem gets significantly better in terms of tooling, like, kind of gotchas, the actual like decentralized sequencers. How does the OP stack superchain thesis play out? Like all of that happens. And so from our point of view is we can take the entire, because again, Farcaster has a relatively small footprint on chain. Should we get to a place where we think it makes sense for Farcaster to have its own OP stack chain? And then I think generally the kind of infrastructure around that is better. We could go make and do a one-time migration. That's the beauty of, the hubs that are running today. Yesterday we're pointing at Gurley testnet as the source of truth, and you can just flip them to change to OP mainnet. So you can imagine taking the state of data, maybe you pause signups for a couple of days, capture that, migrate it to a new chain, and then flip it over. And so I think that that's actually something that we've designed hubs to think about, is that we may change the core chain in the future. There are no immediate plans for that. Like we're just getting out to OP mainnet. We're very excited about it. There's also a version where we say, hey, the composability of OP mainnet long-term actually is more valuable to us. And so I think where we wanted to get is like, we want to find a home that's not a testnet. It's kind of crazy if you think about it. Like Farcaster has been running on a testnet for 3 years. And I think part of that is the promise of that it would eventually be on a mainnet. But I think one of those inspirations was, I don't know if you guys remember when Dark Forest first came out, it was running on an Ethereum testnet. And I think that was a major kind of click in my head, is like, wait a second, as a test bed to say, hey, this is in beta, but it's all transparent. That the code could actually go move to a mainnet, use testnets longer. I don't think you can do that for DeFi because that's the equivalent of playing like poker with fake chips, and like you just don't get the same psychology. But I do think for things like social, like using a testnet for longer as you kind of like figure out like how do you actually want to design this thing, it actually improves your speed of innovation, right? Because you're not dealing with real money. Like, we had to measure 10 times before we deployed stuff to mainnet, and now we still have in the back of our mind, like, did we miss something in the audit or whatever? It's like you're playing for a much bigger stakes. But I do think like testnet is underrated for consumer apps that don't have a pure financial element to it, because you get the same execution environment, but you don't have to worry about like, the kind of real money for a while.
It's funny you mentioned this because I think about a year ago, I tweeted that Ethereum mainnet is the testnet for app chains. So today, the OP mainnet might be a testnet for your own app chain sometime down the road. But anyway, I want to get to the question that everyone cares about. What do you think of Friend.tech? And potentially other competitors like Lens?
Yeah, so let me go through Friend.tech. One, I think the team is extremely crypto native. Like basically everyone on crypto Twitter follows Racer, despite them having a private account. And I think with both TweetDAO and SteelCam, you're actually seeing a kind of crypto native team experiment with social products. I think Friend.tech obviously has had a tremendous amount of growth, and I think even with that cooling off a little bit right now, look, life is but these things last a while in the sense that like counting someone out like 2 days in, and I think they shared some numbers yesterday. I think they still have 20,000 active users. It's more than Farcaster, right? So the things that I think are really interesting about Friend.tech are, one, obviously everyone's talking about the PWA change. And so for those at home who don't know, basically one way to get outside of the App Store 30% tax, like the inability for you to kind of like do good NFT features and stuff, that you can actually just use a website that has a special way of adding it to your home screen that kind of feels like an app, right? And I'm assuming your listeners probably played with Friend.tech, but that only changed actually recently. It's iOS 16.4. Like one thing I would give a recommendation to all builders is like, you should really understand everything Apple is doing because it has such a big impact on potential for user experience. And so like knowing the nuances of this, like not to take credit, but like I tweeted or casted this in February. Like this came out in February, and it was like when 16.4 launches, which it launched basically in May. And then by the end of June, I was looking at the Farcaster mobile like OS thing. You finally got to a place where you could actually launch this feature. Friend.tech is the first one out of the gate. So like good for them for realizing there was an opportunity to actually go do this, and then actually doing the engineering work to kind of build it, right? Like anytime you're the first one to do it, PWAs, like progressive web apps, have existed for a while, but the 16.4 change allowed you to do push notifications. So for the average user, now it feels like a pretty close to a native app. So I think that that's really great. I think that their use of like Privy and like this kind of like using Google or Apple auth, and then kind of abstracting away the private key, like that I think is like best in class. I think all apps basically will be there in the next couple of years, because I actually think there's another change happening to iOS called large blob extensions for passkeys. I don't know if you've ever used a passkey. It's like kind of like when it Face IDs to log into a website. So within the next few years, like every website will basically use this, like, goodbye passwords, it'll be great. But this little large blob extension allows you to actually go stick another encrypted blob, which you could put like a mnemonic or a seed phrase. So I actually fully expect all the kind of like privies of the world or that kind of tech. Goldfinch actually just released a demo of this with a company Turnkey, which is those are both ex-Coinbase teams. But my sense is that the crypto UX is just going to go through this huge renaissance on mobile, because you're just going to abstract away mnemonics. Like today, Farcaster actually asks you to back up a mnemonic. A year from now, like that won't be the case. Like we're going to be able to use some of these tools to actually go and do that. So Friend.tech is the first consumer app to actually take that point of view. It's funny because for 3 years, we've been saying you need to create a new wallet in order to use Farcaster. And more crypto native people were like, why don't you just sign in with Ethereum, like blah, blah, blah. And it's like Friend.tech shows that like this is a vastly superior user experience, especially if you can abstract away, because then you're not worried about, like, especially on mobile, if you've ever tried to use the like connect your like MetaMask or Rainbow or whatever to the app. It's not even those apps. It's just like Apple doesn't handle that transition very nicely. And until Apple improves that, I think like you're going to see these apps that do wallets during onboarding, especially if it's abstracted away from users, like that's I think going to become the norm. And then I think the last thing is the reality, like with Friend.tech, is they are playing around with a kind of form factor that already works pretty well in like Web 2, but is actually insanely simple, but pretty powerful. It's just like, I want to directly connect with a close group of fans. And that you could use in kind of like the OnlyFans context, but also like Twitter obviously has subscribers. That feature I think is poorly implemented on Twitter. Maybe it should be a group chat. So I actually think fundamentally they're playing something that's quite interesting from a vein to like follow and see if you can actually build a sustainable social app.
Any views on Lens?
So I think Lens is similar to Farcaster if we go back to this like federated versus global state. Lens is much more in the same camp as Farcaster in the sense that it's actually more on-chain than Farcaster, right? So I would like view as like you have the federated approaches, Mastodon, AT Proto, then you have like the most on-chain you can get is probably like DeSo, where it's like they literally have their own blockchain. And then I think Lens is probably somewhere between Farcaster, which is probably in the middle of that spectrum, or somewhere close to the middle. And then it's like Lens is somewhere between DeSo and Farcaster. And I think like Lens is interesting in the sense that everything kind of like, I think all the follows are NFTs. It may have changed, but like you can collect any posts. So there's actually a lot of natively on-chain elements to that protocol that I think is quite interesting from if you believe over the next 10 years, more and more stuff is going to be on-chain and composability is important, then that is actually, I think, a pretty sound, like, high-level strategy. I think the one area I would kind of like question is, can you actually scale something like Twitter, right? Which I think like if you go look at how many tweets per second, there's like 6,000 tweets per second. And if you kind of extrapolate like the amount of data, even just conservatively, like how much data you're generating in order to have like kind of like Twitter like performance. And obviously you don't have to do that now, but like just extrapolate it out. If the core architecture involves using a blockchain, I think it gets tricky. They have since, I think, changed. They have this data availability layer called Momoka. The thing that I think is now is like, well, so what is the difference between the stuff that's on-chain versus off-chain? And like, does that actually start to get complex to reason about? So that would be like kind of like the one area that I would say like we have a different opinion in the sense that Farcaster, we tried to keep really simple. You have a very small on-chain footprint because our view is the thing that you need to canonicalize on-chain is the identity. And then we've actually since, and Imran, you brought this up, we've added something called the storage contract. And so actually an FID is free, like it's just an integer. And the thing that you actually pay to get access to the limited amount of space, because our view is like storage is not infinite in a world where you want one machine to be able to run the global state of the network. And so hubs basically look at a contract on OP mainnet that says, did you pay $5 a year? If you did, we're going to give you this amount of, casts, likes, follows, etc. And that's the system. And so in that world, if as a developer, if you pull down a hub, you have every bit of data that's related to Farcaster in one node, just like Ethereum. So you can query that, you can put it in a database. You don't have to worry about going back to the federated thing, peering agreements. You don't have to worry about different layers of APIs. It's just like the hub is the single source of truth for the network. And so that's our bet there, right? And our view was we cannot do this today based on performance of blockchains and just like the reality of being able to run a single node. Like if we want this thing to be decentralized on the order of at least 100 people are running at least a hub. We have about 50 people running a hub today, and we only run 5 of them in the core team. Like that's the trade-off we want to make. We could be totally wrong here. Like it could just be like, no, actually the on-chain composability is the kind of like winning feature. And there's I think a probable case where you're actually just going to have multiple social networks that apply to different things, right? It's not like we have one Web 2 social network, right? Like we actually have a bunch of ones and they kind of compete with each other for certain things. Like, obviously TikTok and Instagram are actually pretty similar at this point, right? YouTube kind of getting into that. So I do think you'll have convergence and you will have multiple places. But yeah, so those are my like kind of general thoughts on those two.
I just want to compare Farcaster and Lens a little bit from the user's point of view and from the human side of things. So as a user myself, I feel that the quality of conversations on Farcaster is higher than what I've seen on Lens, just my personal experience as a user. But it also seems to me that according to some numbers I've seen on Dune, for example, Lens has more users, more active users. I'm not sure how real those numbers are, but definitely within the same order of magnitude. It also seems to me that you spend a lot more time curating the conversations on Warpcast compared to Lens, where Lens feels a lot messier. There's far more developers building different clients. Is my perspective similar to what you've seen? And if so, what are the pros and cons of these two different approaches?
Yeah, so I don't use Lens in terms of like, I'm not a super active user. I kind of occasionally pop in. So I don't want to comment on not being a user. It's not going to be useful. I think where I would say, let me say, I think that there is value in saying kind of like, we are going to allow the market to kind of come up with the set of clients and apps, and we are really going to focus on just building the kind of core protocol and infrastructure. I think that's a reasonable strategy, and I think that is different than what we've done with Farcaster. So our Farcaster, I have a essay on my website. It's called Product-Led Protocol Development. It's an opinionated point of view, and it's saying that in order to build a social protocol, I can't even comment on other protocols, although I would say Uniswap and DeFi, or Uniswap and their uniswap.org is actually somewhat similar in this, and we can talk about that in a second. But my point of view is, start with the goal. We want to have 1 billion plus people using this protocol. In order to get 1 billion plus people using it, you need many apps and services built on top of it. In order for you to have many apps and services, you need developers to be interested. And this is where I have a strong, again, point of view is developers are only interested unless you have quality daily active users. And so our strategy from the beginning is, in order to get quality daily active users, right, to solve that chicken and the egg, you need to go build an app and get the community of quality daily active users to some amount of scale before you start to actually get some of the flywheel effects. And the kind of analogy I love always using is the iPhone. So Apple releases the iPhone in 2007. And I think people forget that for the first year, there were no third-party apps. The only way to do a third-party app was essentially a progressive web app, which was like using JavaScript. They didn't call them that back then. But the App Store came in 2008. It was a year later, after they had already gotten 10 million people. And if you think about it, you buy a phone, you're a daily active user, it's attached to your body. And so I think our point of view is actually in the kind of Apple camp of, we are going to have a full stack opinionated point of view, right? Like, we're building the lowest level stuff on chain, we're building hubs, and we're building the initial app, which we call Warpcast. And I think you might say that the more developer-oriented or kind of like layers of the stack point is Android. And so Android obviously has more users globally than iOS. So again, I would hesitate to say like one is right. Like there are multiple ways to go build this. But I think from our POV, and like one of the things I've been relentlessly focused on is trying to carefully grow the daily active user base of Farcaster so that it also could develop its own distinct culture. And so it's like, you go to Farcaster, like, going back to the status as a service, a lot of the people in the top 100 most followed or active accounts, they don't have big distribution on Twitter. They're actually like micro celebrities within Farcaster, right? Farcaster has its own set of kind of like native memes. Like, people are obsessed with eating fruit with the skin on. Like, I don't know why. Like, that's just, and these are internet strangers, right? It's not even like these people all knew each other. It's like they've kind of met and developed their own culture on Farcaster. And so I think Varun and I have had this opinion that like, it's okay to move slow because we're actually trying to create a culture. In the same way, if you're building a company, like I noticed this at Coinbase, when you're growing slowly, you actually have time to build a culture. And then in 2017, Coinbase was like growing like 50% month over month from an employee. Like, it was just like the employees were just growing crazy in numbers. And we actually had the culture start to fray a lot because you start to realize that at a given point, like, the percentage of the company that has only been there for 3 months is probably 50% or greater. And so in that case, you're actually importing the culture from the previous companies rather than having time to kind of like bake and grow up in your own culture. Same thing happens to a social network. And so I think where we've been really careful over the last 3 years, part of it is also people don't necessarily care. It's not we have like 1 million people waiting to sign up. But I think for us, we've been okay with a slow growth approach because we're effectively building Farcaster culture and doing so in this kind of like very vertically integrated, opinionated way. And so that's, I think, a potential strategy. That's the one we chose, but I don't think it's the only one.
So you may have answered my question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Incentivization, right? If you look at Friend.tech as an example, they bootstrapped their initial user base by offering airdrops as a methodology to get farmers and users and etc. And there is a pseudo way to think about it with Lens. Obviously, Stanley launched Aave, and people expect some sort of airdrop, right? So you see, and maybe this is to answer Charles' question as well, maybe there is some usage that's happening, but it could be inauthentic. We don't know yet. So how do you view incentivized usage? And would Farcast ever, or Warpcast would ever consider it?
Well, ever consider it as like, life is long, you never know. Obviously, I think the Twitter X creator program seems to be off to a pretty strong start, right? Like everyone loves complaining about Elon and, all these things, but I look at my Twitter feed and I see a bunch of people when they get that check every month. They're first as a flex. It's like, hey, look, I'm getting paid. Like I'm witty enough on Twitter to get paid. So I wouldn't underrate that. So very much like something I've observed. But then again, Twitter's also making money, so that there's and so I think the thing I would push on though is both of you. Would you use a product that is basically just trying to incentivize you strictly for some money or airdrop? Okay, maybe, but it's probably a pretty high price point because your time is actually really valuable. And so the question then I become is to go back to is the types of people that you want to follow. How valuable is their time, and how incentivized are they from a kind of are they getting paid? Now, maybe if there's some equity ownership, it's okay, well, if I feel like I'm actually participating in the full upside, then obviously there are probably some regulations around that. But I think that's my challenge is I actually don't think the best people on social media are that incentivized for a couple $100. They're going to use the product that actually allows them to build status, which is hard to quantify. But in getting status and an audience, there's actually a lot of second degree monetization opportunities, right? So if you have a huge audience on Twitter, you now can actually maybe get access to being an angel investor because you can kind of talk about the products that you're angel investing in or things like that. And I actually think audience, and so this is where I always go back to is you are getting compensated by using Farcaster. You put work in and you get an audience, assuming the network promises growth of the network of quality active users. That has actually a compounding effect, right? And so to build an audience, and in the case of Farcaster or Lens or any of the more decentralized social networks, an audience that you own, that or in terms of you own the relationship, that in of itself is actually quite valuable.
Okay, so let's play devil's advocate on this one. So let's say with Friend.tech, I know there's fatigue with a lot of large influencers on Twitter, right? There's a lot, and maybe the checks are fine, and people are really happy with it, but curating a small group of audience that's we can call it superfans, right? There's an element of superfans that's emerging that is you have someone spending $10,000 to go watch a Taylor Swift concert, right? So curating that audience could be an interesting social element that sits on top. How do you feel about that element?
I mean, I think it's a worthwhile experiment, but if you've got a banger meme or tweet, you're going to put that in your small group because they paid, or do you want to go and try to get the 20,000 likes or whatever? That's the game. So it's stated preference. It's I'm so fed up with Twitter, too many bots, all these things that people complain about. When you have the banger, you want it to go viral. That's what people are there for. So I think that would be my push on that.
You mentioned one of your podcasts before that, Warpcast more or less is like a Twitter, right? There isn't, and then over time you want to add features and maybe things that could make it more crypto native. So I guess, for the crypto natives, obviously there's a community there, it's decentralized. So for me, I care about that, right? But for the average normie, where do you see Farcast or Warpcast go to get the average normie to switch from Twitter to Warpcast? What does that hypothetical role look like?
Yeah, so one thing is, this is the first podcast I'm doing in several months. We've been really heads down the migration, so you guys are kind of getting an updated, refreshed view. Since I've done a podcast, we've launched channels, and it's worth maybe talking about that for a second. Channels are a primitive that exists at the Farcaster protocol level. They can kind of be associated around an NFT contract or a URL, so pretty simple primitive. But the way Warpcast has implemented it, and I expect other clients to do similar, is to kind of make it feel like a subreddit. And so it's based on a topic. So you might be interested in books or fitness or the EVM or whatever you potentially go create a subreddit for, it allows you to use a topic-based kind of community in a Twitter-like feed. So that's starting to actually feel different, right? So it's a mix of Reddit and Twitter more than simply just kind of, Twitter traditionally, the way they've done topics is hashtags, which, kind of tend to be spammy and not quite work. So far, channels has been pretty successful. It's like been a massive increase in the amount of posts. We haven't changed the number of users that much. It's re-engaged a bunch of people. People have come back and said, hey, I'm finding myself using Farcaster, or in this case, Warpcast, more as a result of channels. And so that's a good example of where I think we're starting to diverge and actually be something new, which I think is critical to finding product market fit for both Warpcast and then hopefully Farcaster, the protocol. And I think channels is actually a good area to kind of squint and look at where does this get to be more normie in the future. And one of the developers on Farcaster, Jason Goldberg from Airstack, made this point, and I've had this point of view for a while, is look at which Farcaster channels start to take off, right? So if for whatever reason the F1 channel does really well over the next 6 months or a year, maybe it's actually worth building a dedicated app or kind of experience just for people who are opting into this, kind of like F1, they're interested. And that's cool is the underlying channel, like the grouping of people interested in F1 and posting about that, it's completely permissionless. So it's not like Warpcast has any lock in there, and that's by design. And so
True social.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, but right. And so in that case, you could imagine someone builds an experience on top of the F1 channel that if have no interest in crypto, but I just love F1 and this content is actually getting good enough, I might sign up for an app in the App Store. Maybe I pay an in-app purchase that abstracts away the cost of that $5 a year. It's like it's $5 a year to use, the F1 social app. And then you're off to the races and you never know that there's any crypto, there's no NFTs in your feed. It's just strictly like the best possible social network for F1. And so it's actually unbundling Reddit in some ways of taking all of those subreddits and setting it up so that anyone can actually go build a dedicated client to a specific subreddit because the underlying data and APIs are completely permissionless. So to me, that is actually the most likely scenario if you were to ask, like, how are normies using this within 12, 18 months? It's because channels actually start to work. And I can actually take a very narrow experience. So in some ways, if you think about it, it's like old school, it's like forums, right? It's like if you're really into Toyota Tacoma for, off-wheel, off-road driving, there's a forum for that. And forums are just not good on mobile. And so a world where like there are these kind of like nice feeds of like very topical content and people have reputation within those communities and things like that, I think that feels promising from a normie standpoint. But the honest answer is we're just going to continue to iterate. And I think this is a critical part of this is Warpcast is the one doing a lot of this. So we are both dogfooding the protocol, but also trying to actually find a social primitive that we think can actually help scale the protocol. Whereas if we didn't have that, if we were just strictly trying to encourage developers to build stuff, I think just the rate of attempts would be lower because no one is going to care about the protocol as much as we are, at least today, while it's small. Whereas when it gets bigger later, we won't have to do that work, right? Like we if we can kind of cross that chasm, we'll get to a place where the aggregate amount of innovation happening at the protocol level will way outpace any centralized team.
I have one final question. I know we're getting close to time, so I want to make sure Qiao leaves some time for his questions. Farcast V3, you talked a lot about it. There is one new element I want to touch on. Even in Varun's videos, he talked about like hubs and like how can it reasonably scale. You have the process of putting messages and what you should store. And so the question is like, if you want to get Twitter like scale, like, hubs have this, there's a bottleneck for hubs, right? How do we think about scale, right? Like we have 50 hubs that are running. Who should be running hubs? I know apps can also run hubs as mentioned. And so like, if we want to get Twitter-like engagement and usage, do you expect every user to pay $5, $10, $20 a year? Because that, I feel like that is also a point of friction for acquiring new users.
Yeah. So let me break it down in a couple ways here. So the first is the way we designed hubs is we actually looked at AWS, the kind of single largest instance you can take of like a solid state drive for like a server, and said, this is going to be the constraint that we want to design everything around. So don't assume like Moore's law, don't assume like any new breakthroughs in storage. Like we already know that based on the way we've kind of done all the like, per user limits and all that, that with the kind of like off the shelf biggest instance on AWS, which is probably like 1,000 or $1,500 a month, which is probably not the average person. Not probably the average person would never be running that, but a developer might consider doing that. That is going to hold about 10 million users. So we have 20,000 users on the protocol today. So multiple orders of magnitude more than where we are. So we have enough scaling for a while. I think the second thing we have a strong point of view on is people say they care about old tweets and they want like infinite storage. The reality of what makes Twitter interesting is it's happening right now. And the half-life of a tweet, like relative like a day later or a week later or a month later, it like dramatically falls off, right? And I think that there are other ways to do storage of like archival content. Like if something is a really great tweet or you want it for history, like you could go put it on Arweave or whatever. But the system is permissionless, so people can actually go and figure out like how do I capture the best things over time. So if you actually make the perspective that you limit per user, you kind of be aggressive about how things expire within the scheme of things, you can scale that one server model, this like hub model, pretty far. And once you get to about 10 million users, the most likely approach would be sharding. At that point, if you have 10 million active users, like clearly something is working, you'd be bigger than any of the decentralized social media networks today. And I think at that point, it's probably okay to like then say, okay, in order to run the full network, you need to be running two servers. One is A through M and N through Z. Like, that's the simplest version for sharding. The answer though on paying for storage, I think we started with $5 because our point of view is like we looked at the 3 years of data of people using the network and we wanted to solve for the like what they call the like P99 or whatever. So for like 99% of users, this amount of storage is like ample with some buffer. And so that's what we kind of like designed the base account. So 1% of users, they just need to buy 2 storage slots. You can think of them as like arcade tokens. Like if you buy 2 storage slots, you get like double the amount of storage on the network. And our POV is, if you just look at ENS, 2.5 million names, like there's plenty of headroom for people who are willing to pay roughly $10 a year, potentially even more. And not that they're all unique, but like there's a decent amount of demand there. I think that the second thing is we can always lower the price. So if both like storage improves or we decide to do sharding earlier, you could get to a version of the world where we say it's only $1 a year. But I actually think having cost is worth the friction because it actually vastly reduces the amount of spam, right? So if you go to free, it would be overwhelming to the network. So I actually always think that there should be some amount of cost. Now, there could also be some ways to do it where maybe you have to stake. So it's like you actually put something in a smart contract associated with, and so just by time locking it, like you increase the economic cost of spam and things like that. So I definitely think there are other models, but I also think that the other important thing is starting in a couple of weeks, because we gave everyone, when we migrated to OP mainnet, two slots of storage for free for a year. The first people who are going to be signing up after permissionless are going to start paying a protocol treasury $5. And I would like to get that protocol treasury to a point where the protocol itself can hire like an independent developer. So someone not working at Warpcast. And I think that that's actually some of the original sin of some of these like open protocols on the internet is they didn't actually have an independent core team. And getting to a place where the users of the network are funding the development of the network would be, I think, a great place for creating a credibly neutral protocol, right? Like right now, Warpcast is doing, the vast majority of that work. And I think getting to a place where we are participating in developing it, but we aren't the sole developer, I think is like good for kind of like building something that will last for the long term.
Dan, one last question. What advice do you have for founders building in this space?
I think the bear markets are brutal. And, I went through multiple bear markets at Coinbase, very much got close to leaving the company and, through some stubbornness and kind of still being excited about the mission of Coinbase and cryptocurrency more broadly, stuck around and it ended up being a pretty good decision, both, career, economic, just experience, life experience standpoint. I think what's been a fortunate thing for me is like going into building Farcaster, Varun had also experienced that at Coinbase. So we both came in with the perspective that we want to work on this over a long time horizon. And this is not going to, be an overnight success. Like the compounding is going to take a while, but if it works, then it will hit escape velocity very long into the future. And so I actually think going in with a perspective that success doesn't happen right away, easy for me to say, but like that, to remind yourself that like compounding takes a while, especially in something like crypto where you have so much volatility around the market. That's the one piece of advice, because it can help you continue to keep motivated on building.
Sorry, I said the last question, but I have a follow-up question on that. What was the number one lesson you learned building Farcaster?
I think the status as a service essay, I kind of maybe had read it and not considered it, but I think I approached Farcaster of saying, hey, I actually have a pretty good network, both in Silicon Valley and in crypto. I can just go build this version of decentralized social network and pull those people in because I've said that they care about this stuff and whatever. The term I always use is stated versus revealed preference. That like completely failed. And the first 400 people I onboarded, I did like via Zoom call. And a lot of those people were from my network or 1 degree separation from there. And most of those people churned. And so where I'm now to the perspective of is like, if you're going to go build a new social product, for the most part, you're going to find people who are native to that social product, whether they're in your network or not. Ideally, they are, because then it's easier. And those people are going to have their next best alternative is like they don't really have social, standing on the other, something like Twitter. And so you're going to be minting a new set of people, new set of influencers on the network. And so if I could have given myself advice at the beginning, it's just focus on people who have fewer than 10,000 followers on Twitter. And it's just like, don't worry about any of the big names. They'll come later. And so I think that would have saved a decent amount of time. And so I think that has been a like core learning in terms of like trying to build a new social experience, is like focus on the people who don't already have a ton of status on the other one.
Similar to DeFi, where you focus on retail first, and then eventually whales and market makers come.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great analogy.
Great. Well, Dan, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you going through Farcaster, V3, your challenges and growth, personally, and then obviously from a career perspective. So thank you. Any final words you want to say? Thanks
for having me. The questions were great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
That was a great conversation with Dan. A lot of learnings, at least from how Dan thinks about building the Farcaster and the Warpcast community. Some of the lessons that I've learned is he takes the slow approach, which is building an authentic community. I think there was a part of the Farcaster or Warpcast launch where he manually invited each person to the community, and this gives them like this Apple-esque experience, right? And you're actually curating the people in these communities that can give you the content that's needed to attract and keep the user sticky. So I completely understand and respect the decisions around that. But it also means that you're not growing as fast, right? And maybe that's a good trade-off compared to, say, something like Friend.tech, where they used like a token as a way to incentivize users to come and farm the platform. So I thought that was like an interesting element. And there's many others, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
So he said something very interesting about how the status game and the financialized game don't mesh together. So my understanding is, for example, when you're on Twitter, when you're a creator on Twitter, you're playing a status game, right?
Yeah.
You grow your influence by growing your audience and your number of followers.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas on, for example, Friend.tech, it's more of a financialized game because people are there to speculate on other influencers' tokens and potentially farm for the airdrop. And he said that he's singularly focused on the status game for Farcaster, which, by the way, makes a lot of sense to me. Like, he thinks that he's never seen a social app where both work together, like a social app that fills the need of the status-seeking needs of humans as well as the possibility for making money. He's never seen an app like that. However, on Friend.tech, I think you've seen this as well. On Friend.tech, I actually see both, right? You do have people like Kobe and other crypto native influencers who are there not necessarily for the money, but actually for the status. Like you mentioned, like they put out long form content to their audience.
Mm-hmm.
For me, that's a form of status seeking game. On the other hand, you have those creators that came from OnlyFans.
Mm-hmm.
They are entirely there for monetizing their audience, and they said it. Like they love this app because they have new ways to monetize the audience. And so both are happening on Friend.tech. maybe it's not a good idea to have both, but at least what we're seeing is there is both right now. So that's really interesting. All right, so the other thing I learned was that, so Dan said he acquired his first 400 users by just getting on a Zoom call with them, by doing the things that don't scale. And he also said that they all churned. And he later realized that the users that did stick Farcaster are those who have fewer than 10,000 users on Twitter. And anecdotally, I interviewed a dozen of Farcaster users, independent of Dan. Like Dan doesn't know this. I interviewed Farcaster users and I asked them, why do you use Farcaster over Twitter? Because when I first saw Farcaster or Warpcast, the client, it looked exactly like Twitter. And they told me that those users on Farcaster, they told me that they use Farcaster because they don't have a big audience on Twitter. And they can far more easily build a bigger audience on Farcaster and get bigger engagement. So very interestingly, I came to very similar conclusions to Dan from my personal user interviews.
Interesting. There's a couple other things that, just touching on this topic, that I learned was the fact that channels is actually becoming a big thing for Warpcast. And it turns out that, the same people want to talk to others in different topics. So you could think of this as like kind of a competitive landscape against like Reddit and like subreddits, where you have like certain topics and people are like, there's a moderator and there's people that are like purely focused on that topic. And you saw some of this early with Twitter, right? Like the whole reason for hashtag was the fact that you could follow that thread or conversation of that thread all throughout the world from all of the people that are using Twitter. But the problem with it was that I don't think they focused a lot of that intention on building a product around or a feature around that idea. And I think where Warpcast is capitalizing on it is by building a specific channel for different topics. And now they're expanding to all the different topics that are out there. And there's like native communities around those ideas, and they're like really, really highly engaging. So, yeah.
On this subject, he said that he hopes that if one of those channels becomes super popular, he hopes to see other clients being built specifically for that subject, which is really interesting because like we're basically talking about the unbundling of Twitter, right, into various, or unbundling of Reddit into various different dedicated apps. By the way, I saw this recently with a fertility app, actually quite a few of them. So people talk about fertility on Reddit as subreddits, right? And for some reason, the subreddit or Reddit as a format itself is not the most conducive to that kind of conversation. And so people build dedicated apps just for that particular topic, which is fertility. And so I can definitely see this go somewhere.
Yeah. And let's maybe touch on some things that happened in the past to talk about like what if a world would look like, right? So an example that Dan mentioned was one of the reasons why he's building Farcaster is the fact that it's credibly neutral, right? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't delineate between different users. All users can use the product. It doesn't matter. And if you look in the world today, on Twitter, as an example, you have like, Donald Trump that got deplatformed, Kanye West, and, countless others. And the idea is like, should a social network be in charge of pushing users out based on what they say? Like, who should be in charge of that, right? That's like one element of what he talked about. And then the second element is like, when these people leave, they go join other social media products, right? Because they still need an audience to communicate to. And so an example of what both Trump and Kanye West did was Donald Trump went to Truth Social, which is like a right-wing focused social media product. And you have like Kanye West that ended up buying Parler. Yep. And which is another like Twitter client, if you want to call it, that's focused on like which you invested in, which ended up, being a place where you could talk about whatever you want. And so if you want to like put like all of these puzzles together, what you could see is a world where you have these channels, they become so big, right, that it warrants an app for each of those channels, and they could grow in such a way that Twitter can't grow. Because Twitter is a product that's more generalizable. So when they build something that will be good for everyone else. And so it's just easier for them to scale. You can't like build a product or a feature for a specific niche. It just doesn't work that way. But if you build a client for, a specific niche, maybe they want, features that nobody else wants, right?
Yep.
Let's talk about gaming. Maybe they want a Twitch integration, right? Or Discord integration. I don't know. But I could see a world where at least like the top 10 communities could get like a very strong, like they can get their own like client and have dedicated features that are built for those communities.
Yeah, that's a really interesting analogy. So what you're saying is the likes of Parler and Truth, they're basically, hypothetically, they can be built on top of a open platform of conversation like Farcaster as their own dedicated clients for their dedicated communities, which, by the way, tend to be political conversations between the conservatives, right?
Yep.
I can see that.
Yeah, and maybe that's why, Twitter has only 300 million monthly active users, because, the social graph is enough, like the types of conversations that happen is enough for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. And then like, and I thought Threads was interesting because the social graph is very different, right? Compared to Twitter's social graph. It's yet to be seen what's going to happen, what type of like communities emerge out of Threads. But I thought that it was interesting the way they launched. And so we'll see what happens with Farcast and Warpcast, because I do think that is an opportunity for them to go after.
Agreed. Anything else you learned?
I learned that identity and authentication, or like there's 4 key problems that Farcaster wants to solve. I mentioned this in our talk, but authentication, identity, availability, and consistency. The first 2 parts are, mutually beneficial, right? So there's like identity and authentication. And what I learned was, I mean, and you and I already know this, but what I learned is like, if from a Warpcast perspective, is like build out the community first, right? Build out people to use the app first before you think about authentication. And what I mean by authentication is very similar to like the example he gave with Google Gmail and Google OAuth, right? Like being able to log in using your Google authentication or your Google identity. And so the idea is like everyone needed email, so they naturally gravitated to like Yahoo Mail and Gmail. And it turns out Google just realized like, hey, now that we have this user base, why don't we use this as a way to log into other accounts or other apps? And this makes a lot of sense. And so like we get a ton of pitches in Alliance, and what they talk about is like, we want to be the de facto identity for crypto. Well, you have to build something that people want first, useful first. And once you get that user profile, then you could use that as a leverage, or on the other side, the demand side, as a way to get people to use your product with other products that are out there. And I think that made a lot of sense. Like I would 100% focus on bringing organic users to the product first, and then think about how authentication could play in the long run. And you could very well see like log in with Farcaster, right? In a multi-app world. But in order for us to get there, you really have to focus on building the community and the user base first.
And also, Coinbase is best positioned to become the identity layer in crypto. Like Coinbase is just best positioned for a lot of things because they own the user onboarding, they own the KYC, and now they own their own chain, which is Base, right? I don't know. I think Base, just side note, Coin, the stock will outperform Ether in the next bull market.
Alpha alert. Yeah, funny enough, I wrote about identity in 2018, and I talked about how Coinbase is well positioned to be the de facto identity for crypto. And at that time they acquired a decentralized identity company. Forgot the name of what they called, but what they allow you to do is kind of become the de facto OAuth for crypto. So it seems like Coinbase has been working on it for a long time. I think the question is like regulation is one, right? 2 is like, how would someone like Coinbase monetize and own the stack, right? And now you're starting to see the fruition of that today, right? And the way it's happening, as you mentioned, is Coinbase owns the identity, they own the wallet, and we're talking not the wallet like the exchange wallet, but we're talking a browser wallet, the rollup, and now the apps that are being built on top of that, the transaction fees. So really, it seems like they're building for a Coinbase world. And with identity, I think, and the roll-up strategy, it seems like they're going to own the entire stack from that perspective. But that's a different that's a whole different topic. What else did you learn, Qiao?
I mean, this is very much for founders, but do the things that don't scale. To onboard your first 100 users, you have to just get on a call with them, DM all of them on Twitter, DM your friends, get on a Zoom call, show them your product, and just do that in a brute force way. Even if that doesn't work, which by the way, it didn't work in the case of Dan, of Farcaster. A lot of their users churned, but by doing that, you will learn a lot about your users. So for example, Dan learned that the first 400 users that he onboarded by brute force just didn't care about decentralization, right? So even if do the things that don't scale doesn't necessarily work on the first attempt, you will learn a lot from your users.
Yeah, that's a solid point, because I see this all the time where founders will try to do things and automate things and grow their team out in unnecessary ways. And it turns out like being lean, like I don't know if this is still correct or not, but I know that the Farcaster team is very small.
It's like on the order of 10 people, like no more than 20.
Exactly. And they 20,000, daily active users is not bad. Or sorry, 2,000 daily active, but a total of 20,000 users roughly that have signed up for the Farcaster or the Warpcast product. It's not bad without any incentives, without anything, just purely a bare bones product that's similar to Twitter. I think it's pretty good. Obviously, a lot can change, right? And I did ask Dan this question, which is like, would you ever introduce incentivization, right, as a way to get more users on your product?
I'm a little bit disappointed.
He didn't say no, but I think he's maybe. I'm curious. Like, I want to hear your thoughts on it. But he talked about Twitter, right, and how creators, now that Twitter creators are getting checks, they're flexing their check, right, and how they're making money. So he said there is an important element of that he thinks should be looked at. So I do think he is going to bring incentivization, but I don't know if he wants to call it out bluntly in front of all of our audiences.
I think people who are farming for airdrop will be disappointed in the short term. That's my my hunch.
Yeah, I mean, I think the audience is they're not compatible. Like you have the crypto degens and traders, that got rugged by Bald, right? As an example. And then you have, people that are long-term, Vitalik comes on Farcaster, he sends out a cast every 3 to 5 days, and he's very diligent about it. You have Balaji and others that have very strong follower base and they continue to post on there. So I do think there is an important element of that. And so we'll have to see how he can authentically grow his community through incentivization. I also learned, at least with Farcaster V3, there are a couple new changes, which I think we should talk about. One is like hubs are nodes on the network within the Farcaster ecosystem. They hold identity, messaging of the content, the likes, the replies, all of that in this like hub, right? It's like a server, right? Or a node. And there's 50 of these nodes that are running across the Farcast ecosystem, and they run a gossip network that will communicate with each other about the state of the Farcast ecosystem, messages, users, etc. What I learned is that like there is inherent storage cost within the hub ecosystem, and that for users that want to use Farcaster, they'll need to store their data somewhere, and they'll have to store in the hub. And there's a $5 fee charge per year for users to use the hub. So I asked them a question of like, would someone want to pay $5 a year? Like, I mean, I remember when WhatsApp started with $1 a year, if you remember that, and I didn't join. I mean, it was not about being cheap, but it is about maybe.
By the way, I subscribed to Twitter, pay $9 a month, and then I unsubscribed after 3 months. I just didn't see any value from that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for calling me cheap. And maybe it's a cultural thing, but maybe I'm not the right person, right? I'm one data point, but yeah. But I asked him this question, and he said over time he could see the element of sharding, right, and slowly lowering the cost of people that are onboarding to the Farcaster ecosystem. So I thought that was great. Permissionless signups was another area that he talked about, which is right now you need to get an invite to use Farcaster. And so now I think in a month, anyone can permissionlessly sign up.
The permission sign up is actually a feature, not a bug. So far for Farcaster, I feel it's a indirect way to curate the community and ultimately curate the conversations. Because you're only inviting, like his first 500 users are like the people that are builders and investors in Silicon Valley, like, or the crypto natives in his network, in Dan's network. And so, and those people would only invite their friends to Farcaster. So you create this critical mass, like by creating this permission, it's easier for you to create a critical mass around this group of people who have something in common between them. If you go fully permissionless right off the bat, I think you end up with a bunch of different groups of communities that have different interests, and potentially each community is too small to become a critical mass, and therefore to create good, meaningful conversations between them. So far, I feel like it's a feature, not a bug.
True. I mean, if you think about Facebook and the way they launched with Harvard and others, like people, it grew like wildfire. So there is an element of like people still want to be a part of the or associated with those communities.
Yep.
So yeah, I agreed with that.
By the way, Friend.tech also had invite codes, which is completely permissioned. And to me, that was also a feature, not a bug. Because when you pair the invite code with the Ponzinomics, like this is such a powerful pair. You have a Ponzinomics, and in order to play that Ponzinomics, you have to have an invite code. So imagine how much FOMO that creates, right?
Yeah. No, that's actually true, because I remember using Friend.tech and like I got like 100 messages of people that just wanted it. And I thought there was some sort of airdrop component by sharing my Friend.tech codes. I'm like, yeah, please, just use it. But there was no airdrop for that. So, but yeah, so it was this, process of being a part of something, right?
Yep.
And so I 100% agree with that. Another thing that he talked about was, now that we have permissionless signups, all of the client apps that are being built around the Farcast ecosystem can actually grow, because they're not growing right now, right? Because they have to still rely on a permission signups program, right? Like they have to either get approvals or, they have to ask Dan, etc. So, like maybe there's a breakout channel, right? Let's say one of the channels there's a breakout channel, and someone's like, I'm just going to build an easy client for this. And now they can get permissionless signups, and they can start to grow their own user base, all still within the Farcast ecosystem, but the app itself grows. So it's interesting to see that now. So I'm curious to see if this is going to actually be a thing. So that's one thing I'm going to be looking at. The move to OP stack was also very interesting.
Yes.
What did you learn from that?
The move to the whole OP ecosystem does not surprise me at all, because the whole West Coast ecosystem, they're on OP. Like if you think about it, like Zora, Coinbase, and the independent builders that we know of, they're all on OP. Arbitrum, by the way, is more like the rest of the world, if you just pay attention to the kind of developers that are on each ecosystem. So I'm not surprised that they're on the OP ecosystem. What I found really interesting is why they picked OP mainnet versus building an app chain on top of the OP stack, which, by the way, Zora and Coinbase did for their chains. And Dan's reasoning for that is that the tooling is too early for launching app chains. And I can totally see that. Like for an application that has 20,000 users, it is big enough of a tech risk to bet on a whole new tech stack of launching your own app chain. And he said that he'll probably consider it in a year or two when the tooling becomes a lot more mature. So that's really interesting, because that tells me that it's still very early in the app chain thesis. Very, very early.
That is very interesting. He also brought some design choices for that reason, right? Some of the things I'll mention is like he stayed on testnet for 3 years before choosing the OP stack, OP mainnet. And then he also said that the reason why he picked OP mainnet versus an OP rollup was the fact that this composability reasons, like there could be some very strong composability trade-offs that he can make by going on mainnet versus its own rollup. And that even later, they can always switch to their own rollup by pointing their smart contracts to a rollup. What do you think?
I'm not sure what that means exactly. Like what would be an example of a composability between Farcaster and some other app on OP mainnet?
Authentication, right? Like,
so you mean other apps using the Farcaster ID to authenticate? That's
right, and that could be interesting too, right? So, yeah, so we'll see where that comes along. The other thing he mentioned, and it didn't really click for me, right? So, Arbitrum, when Arbitrum OP launched, right? Arbitrum became the de facto DeFi chain. That like really resonated with me, and I got it. And so even within our program, everybody that was building DeFi, they were going to Arbitrum. I mean, obviously you have a smaller ecosystem of DeFi in OP, like you have Quenta and Synthetics and other. So not discounting the work that's been going on there, but there was a very strong, resilient DeFi community on Arbitrum. And I've been thinking to myself, like, why is the OP stack, why is that becoming a de facto consumer, chain? Like, and like he put it together pretty succinctly, but one is like, you have Coinbase with Base, right? Like obviously, like, they have 100 million users that are KYC that can permissionlessly use Base and DeFi products. And then there's like, within the OP stack. He also mentioned WorldCoin, right? With the identity piece, and Friend.tech. Those are the three, I would say, signals that, like, I mean, I'm sure they were already talking about moving to OP anyways from a while ago, but those are the three signals that he saw and said, like, okay, OP is where we're going to build this thing. And so the question is, like, if that's the case, like, what does that world look like within the OP stack? Like, how do you think about that?
I don't know. It's just I suppose in 5 years, a bunch of app chains with their own dedicated apps, and then somehow interoperable with each other. I don't know. I have no idea. What do you think?
I mean, similar, right? Like, I think if that's the case, then the mind share of the builders are just going to go to the OP stack for consumer.
Yep.
All consumer related products will go to the OP stack versus Arbitrum or other rollups. So I just thought that was a very interesting signal there for those that are building consumer.
Yeah. By the way, did you look into the L2s by the other centralized exchanges?
Like OKX has a layer 2. Mantle from BitDAO has a layer 2.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think who else launched.
I feel like they all have a very unique go-to-market, targeting a very specific geographic region. Do you feel that? Optimism is obviously West Coast.
Yeah. I don't know. Like, what signals have you seen to determine that?
I don't know, just the initial gut feeling.
Okay. How is AltLayer building its... because AltLayer is a startup from the Asia ecosystem, right?
Mm-hmm.
What stack are they using? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. It's interesting. It's an interesting call out because in theory, you could see rollups that are geographic focused, right?
Yeah.
And there's a whole different aspect of composability that can come around it just based on building for those regions. So yeah, I'd be curious to see what happens with that. Yeah, I think we touched on everything, right? Anything else?
That's it.
All right. That was a great conversation. Thanks for tuning in to Good Game. Hit subscribe if you haven't. We'll talk to you again next week.
Talk to you later.
Thanks for listening to Good Game. Don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next week.